Before I start, can I check? I'd rather not use the mic. Can everyone hear me? Is it good? If I can do without the mic, that would be better. Okay. Actually, despite what Peter said, I'm actually going to focus really on some example case studies on the economics, and then I'm going to try to bring out some different parts from previous studies on economics of mobile networks, and then show how we're trying to pull the different aspects of that together and apply it to 5G NORMA. Can I have a quick show of hands, please? How many people here are not part of the NORMA consortium? How many people are kind of... Right. I looked at the who was meant to attend the workshop, and it seemed, how many of you would say you're technical? Good. So what I wanted to do was to try and show something that might be slightly different to the kind of traditional engineering background that most postgraduates would be familiar with. So we'll see how it goes, and if you get bored, bear with me. Okay. Let's have I've got the 4 o'clock slot, so I'll try and make it a little bit more interesting. All the people that put their hands up because they're kind of in the summer school, let's have 4 quick suggestions. What's the purpose of a modern communications system? Anyone? Someone? Yeah, just give me one example. What's one example of a what's one purpose of a modern communication system? Revenue. Revenue. Okay.
Money.
Someone else? Money. Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Yes?
More extension.
More extension? Okay, so more coverage?
More coverage.
Okay, yeah? Yes?
To assist communications and societal economic benefits through that.
Okay, societal benefits. Yeah, yeah. Mark's talking, so I'm going to ask him for one.
Yeah. I would say just to means to get the information I want, or whatever.
Okay, and the means, okay.
Access for me is the major.
So what I wasn't sure is, I wasn't sure what people were going to say. Changing screens is really slow. That was a mistake. So, improved communications between citizens, perhaps. Actually, one of the things is we could talk about improving business efficiency. One of the metrics that comes up quite often is that the business efficiency improvements and the value to other businesses is roughly 6 times the profitability of mobile operators. We want fast connectivity. I wasn't sure if someone was going to say to get the latest handsets or latest technology. We simply want it to be affordable. Actually, it's pretty important that we maintain national infrastructure. There's large programs in most developed economies to make sure that we can have a sustainable. I wasn't sure if anyone was actually going to say that the key priority is to track individuals. And of course, it's really all about getting the cutest, latest handset. All right. I want to try and go over some headline numbers to try to get a context for the technology that we're all familiar with. So here, for example, any developed economy, comms is quite important. In the UK, it's about 3% of GDP. Just to put that in context, one of the arguments that everyone's having, some of you might be aware there's a vote this week in the UK. The Brexit vote and the net contribution that Britain makes to the UK is about 8 billion, which is a tiny fraction of this. One of the assumptions in a recent EU study in the benefit of introducing 5G sooner, and it's expected to increase the GDP by 1%. That's a ballpark estimate. In the meantime, we're arguing about potential fractions of 0.5% and misrepresenting it. So it's actually quite interesting just to have a ballpark estimate for some of these numbers. It's also interesting to know that in terms of value to the economy, mobile is by far the biggest net worth contribution, followed by broadcasting, and then followed by satellite. And the satellite value is dominated by TV aspects of satellite broadcasting. Okay, another thing. How many of you, I think everyone's got the idea of profit. How many of you are familiar with terms like consumer surplus or welfare? Very few. Good. So some of you are, but if most of you are kind of got an engineering background, you might not be familiar with those things. I'll try to introduce them and build this up. Okay. So it's easy to talk about the profitability of companies. But actually, most of the value, for example, of Vodafone or EE, the consumer might pay something like £30 per month for the mobile subscription. But if you ask them what is the value that they perceive of having access to those services, it's much more than £30 a month. If it was less than that, then they wouldn't pay the £30. If it's worth less than £30 to them, then you wouldn't pay that. They actually get more value than that, and that excess benefit is the surplus that the consumers get. And that also contributes to society. The bottom line is that it's actually normally much higher than the profitability. And one of the things that we'd like to do when we're trying to make a policy decision is make sure that it's benefiting society, not just always about, it's not just about profitability, there are other economic aspects that have to be considered. Okay. What am I going to do? I'm going to try to pick out about 4 different case studies that we've done, partly because it's easier than having to do everything from scratch. But I'm also going to try to make them reasonably relevant, and I'll pull out a couple of aspects. And then, hopefully, some of it will be interesting if you've just focused on a technology issue for most of the day. I'll try and come at it from a slightly different angle. I'll then look at the kind of issues that governments have to take into account when they have to make decisions and some of the other aspects that impact society. And then later on, I'll look at how we're trying to do things in 5G, and when we're trying to do some of the economic modelling, I'll pick up some of the themes that we've touched on in some of the earlier examples, and that's what we're going to be trying to do in aspects of the modelling the cost of 5G networks. Okay, this is quite old now. Some of this goes back to about 2004. Again, just to put some numbers into perspective, in the UK, the 3G licenses were sold for 22.4 billion. That's at least the year's net contributions to the EU from the UK. Across Europe, the 3G licenses sold, I think, for 120 billion. That's an awful lot of years' contribution to the EU from the UK. There was uproar in the Netherlands shortly afterwards, after the 3G licenses, partly because they didn't raise quite as much money as the UK and Germany did. And there was questions being asked in the Netherlands. So one of the things that people wanted to know is how much money should have been raised, how many operators, how many licenses should have been allowed. And we're going to talk about the key things about producer surplus and consumer surplus in this example. So there's a key issue really, and it was, well, in the UK there were 5 licenses granted. It was possible really, there was 12 different 5 megahertz bands in each direction, and it's possible you could have had 4 operators, 3, 5 or 6. And we want to go through the costs and benefits of having different numbers and what that would mean to the operators, to the government, and also to society. Okay, So in order to do this kind of stuff, you've got to make some sort of estimates of the market size. Well, you kind of know that because you've got an estimate of the population and you know how many people use mobile phones. You've got to know how much you're going to pay, you've got to know whereabouts they are, you've got to know stuff about what the geography of the country is. And through that, you can actually work out how many base stations you need. And if you have fewer operators and each of them with more spectrum, in general, you can get away with an awful lot less infrastructure than if you have more. Okay. You can put all that into a spreadsheet or complicated model. This is a spreadsheet, and you can actually work out for different amounts of spectrum and different amounts of operators, and each of them providing services to a different percentage of the population. Say it's equal, you know, if they 5 of them, each of them 20% or whatever. And you can actually get what the cost is for an efficient network to provide that capacity, and you can get the cost per gigabyte or whatever. And then what you can do is you can then say, well, if I have a very efficient network, I can quickly do that. I know how many people are there. I can work out the profitability to an operator. And this is what operators will do when they're trying to work out, well, how much should I pay for a license? Pretty obvious. One of the other things that you can do, which is a little bit more tricky, is you can say, well, if that's the efficient costs of production, and if there's a perfectly optimal economic system, you can do this optimization problem, and you can work out with different levels of people's willingness to pay what the benefit to the consumer is. And it takes a little bit of jiggery-pokery and things like Kuno and Nash optimization and all this sort of stuff. But it's doable. And you've got to make certain assumptions. And you can question the assumptions as to whether they're perfect. And I think the one thing is that they're always going to be wrong. But you can do sensitivity analysis. You can say, well, if it was that value, it could be there. If it was that value, it's probably somewhere in between. So you'll never get it right, but you can bracket roughly where it is. And then you can look at what the outcomes are likely to be. So, if the Dutch government had wanted just to maximise the welfare, it should really have optioned for licenses. And in general, the fewer licenses, the better, because there's going to be less competition. It's cheaper for the operators to deploy their network. If they've got more spectrum each, they'll pay more for their licenses. But that's not really the government's role. And actually, even with only 4 licenses, the viability in the Netherlands of each of the operators was doubtful. Under the most optimistic scenarios, 6 might have just about worked. But it was far, far too risky. And of course, there's no point letting a license to an operator that's likely to go out of business in a short time in the future. So what we actually showed is that the Dutch government were actually under enormous criticism from their press when they let, I think it was 4 licenses. But actually, even when you look at it, it was still a really dodgy business case. And subsequently, there was harmonisation and rationalisation within the Netherlands. It was actually quite nice because we did all these numbers, and it turned out that it actually matched. It kind of gave the Dutch economic minister a sort of get out of jail free card, and we didn't even fudge it. It was great. But it kind of worked out that it was always dodgy. So the fact that it didn't get as much money as the UK or Germany made, well, that's kind of irrelevant. It's a different country, it's got different demographics, it's got different rollout considerations. And even if someone overpaid and is cross-subsidised between countries as part of a group, it doesn't actually mean that what they paid in any one country is bad. And that's not even the issue. The issue is, what's the services like to the consumers, because that actually is a much bigger contribution to society. Okay. So we've got the idea of there's more than just the profitability of the 2 operators, and there's more than that has to be considered. Let's actually look at a second example. Could you guys all read the bit in italics, please? This happened in 2011. The UK regulator was thinking about letting the 800 megahertz license, and they thought, well, actually, we could do something slightly different here. So, I think it was the lady in the middle who said, well, one of the things that you want to do is have better coverage. Okay, so this is one of the things that Ofcom recognized. There was this spectrum at 800 megahertz, good propagation conditions. Hey, maybe it's really good, we can get better coverage and we can boost the availability of mobile services to more of the population. And they basically come up and said, you know, we could go to 90%. And then the government come back and said, no, you're going to do an awful lot better than that. And they actually said that they wanted 98% of the population to be covered. And one of the things then that Ofcom did is they said, well, you know, they have to work out, is that viable? There's no point trying to force operators to do something if it's not cost effective, or if the cost to the operators is going to drive them into such a position that it's not a viable business, then that's not sustainable. So, how do you go about working out what the cost of serving the people are, and then coming up with reasonable or feasible coverage obligation commitments? Well, first we've got to recognise a few basics, really. It depends whereabouts you are. Trying to get coverage in bits of Scotland and Wales is quite different than bits of England. Covering bits of London is actually quite good, because you can put a base station up and you can actually fill it, use its capacity quite readily a large amount of the time, because there's loads of people to share it. That's not the case if you're up in the back end of nowhere in Wales. I nearly said Scotland, but there's nowhere in Scotland that's the back end of anywhere. It's just fantastic everywhere. It also depends on on whereabouts the sites are. Actually, sites are very differently available in different bits of the country. I don't know about other bits of Europe in as much detail, but there are bits of Scotland. Scotland actually has, it's one of the countries where a very, very tiny percentage of the population owns a very large amount of land. So if you go in, it kind of goes back to feudal times and highland clearances and things. But if you go back to some of those areas and you see the landlord and you say, can I have a mobile base station? And he says no. And then you say, that's okay, I'll go and put it 5 miles away. Well, it's the same landlord. The estates cover large areas. There are some bits of Scotland that are incredibly difficult to cover for that reason. And now what's happened is that became a fundamental thing about 20 odd years ago, maybe 30. And there's a paradigm shift there as well. Local people now want coverage. And of course, the operators are now thinking, well, actually, I don't want to bother with that because I've met a large covering most people. They're used to not getting it. They've got their phone subscription anyway. Why bother going to the expense of having to put a base station up when it's going to be lightly used? Part of that legacy is because of the difficulty of getting those sites in the first place. Okay, the bottom line is that you've got to take into account some of these differences. All right, let's think about, well, how are we going to do this capacity concept? And I want you to look at this diagram because we're going to come back to something like this a bit later, and we're going to modify it. All right. The kind of accepted wisdom is that if you want to try and make a network that can provide coverage and capacity, you've got 3 things you can play with. You've got the technology you use, and that can get more or less efficient, and we expect that The spectrum efficiency will increase over time, and we can work out what's going to happen because we know the roadmap. We know the different ways in which we can lay out networks, and we know what we can achieve with that, whether they're macro sites or small cells or whatever. And we know how much is indoor and outdoor, and we can work out how to lay out a network. And we can cost that, and we know what the traffic it will accommodate, and so on, and the performance that it will deliver. And then, of course, the other thing that you can do is that we can always throw more spectrum at something, and normally that's a very inexpensive way of improving capacity and performance, depending on how much you have to pay for spectrum. Okay, so they're the three kind of key variables that we have that we can play with. We've got to kind of pick different areas that are going to somehow be representative. And we can take London, which is in some ways a bit special, but in other ways it's dense urban area. We can take suburbia, and then we can take somewhere that's out, really very rural. Bits of Lincolnshire are really quite rural and very low population density. Okay, we've picked that, we've characterized it. We then come up with how we're going to go about doing this. We've got the site data. For this, by the way, because it was done through Ofcom, we could get access to the operator's sites. The regulator said, well, actually, we're going to do this as part of the license. We're going to do, we've got this coverage obligation as part of the license process. We want to know all your sites, because of course, you say we want to set this threshold at a higher standard. The government had already said that they wanted 98%. So if you're a rational operator who's trying to protect shareholder value, the right reaction, Mark, what's the right reaction if you're an operator trying to protect shareholder value?
I don't know.
Most operators would say, oh, that's really difficult, we can't do that. And then you get into a discussion. And then, of course, what you've then got to do is, because, what's the incentive for people trying to, the profitability is always going to be most for the site that you put, the very first site that you put in a densely populated area is likely to be busy for a much higher percentage of the time than something you put down in a very remote area. So it's actually not really, the profitability to an operator is much less for some of these sites in rural areas. So immediately you're going to get a conflict between what the government is saying is setting and what people are going to be prepared to offer or commit to. We were lucky that we could get site data, population basis, known, clutter, terrain, etc. We then had to be able to work out, well, how would you optimally try to go from your 90% coverage, which you've got at the moment, and how would you optimally try to increment that to get to 98? And you've got to have rules, and you've got to take it into account. You've then got to take into account what you could do with microcells, you could do it with small cells, you could do it with lots of different ways. The indoor, how much of that are you going to offload onto Wi-Fi networks, etc. And the bottom line is that there's lots of different ways in which you can do it. So you don't try to do it by hand, you come up with a model and you try to, you optimize it. And you come up with something that for different scenarios and different conditions, the different costs of increasing the coverage, it's got this kind of characteristic shape, kind of hockey stick curve. But although they've all got the same characteristic shape, there are still cheaper ways of doing it than others, depending on that blend of the deployment strategy that you want to use and the area that you're trying to cover. Okay. And this is actually just the number of sites. Of course, sites aren't all equal and they're not all the same cost. Oops. If we actually have a look at what happens if we're trying to do it's missing the left-hand side. That says macro cell. And the right-hand side says community cell, small cell. But by the way, all the data that I'm showing here is in the public domain. All these studies are public, all these graphs, all the assumptions that have been used that drive all these results, and the methodology that was followed, it's all public, if any of you don't want to watch football tonight. So if we have a look at the kind of curves, and you can see that as you go up for more coverage, the cost is rising quite steeply, and at the end of the curve, of course, it's rising more steeply all. Interestingly, this, because it's kind of government-driven, it was looking at a 25-year present value. Again, so typically, an operator would seek to recover their costs in a very short period of time, maybe 6, 8, 10 years. Governments, when they're looking at investing in infrastructure, they would look at a much longer time frame, and you'd expect a much lower rate of return, because it's for the welfare, it's for the benefit of all society. So this is actually costed over 25 years. And that means that you've got to include the cost of replacing sites as they get old and have to be replaced. Again, it's interesting that when you try, particularly with macrocells, it doesn't make sense to try to use macrocells to cover the very tail of the distribution, because you've got to put this big, enormously powerful, high-capacity thing, and it's only serving 2 dogs and a fisherman. It actually makes a lot more sense, depending on the area, that you're using small cells, as long as you've got sufficient backhaul there. So you've got all these other things to take into account. Okay, bottom line, it can be done, you can cost it, you can work out optimal strategies, and then you can work out, is it possible and is it feasible to get that 98%? All those answers or the results and the assumptions were made public, and that was then available to operators before they had to make any license bids on their auction. So they had the same knowledge, they had their own in-house expertise, and then they had all the other information that we had. That was all done through a public consultation exercise. So they're forewarned and forearmed, so they can take into account any obligation as part of their decision process as to whether they're prepared to bid or not, and how much. Okay, let's take a slightly different case. And this one, we're going to look at really the business case angle here. And we're going to come up against slightly different metrics that are being enumerated and evaluated. Small Cell Forum asked us to look at the business case for enterprise small cells. Small Cell Forum have basically, they've had a program of different phases over the last 8 years or so, where they phase 1 that essentially were sort of femtocells for domestic use, and then phase 2, which was enterprise, get small cells into buildings. 3, I think 3 might have been urban small cells, so you get small cells for urban use in cities. And I think it was either 4 or 5 was rural cases, and they were looking at even using satellites to provide backhaul for very remote locations. So they've had a phased program. This one was looking at enterprises, and the idea being that we asked a whole bunch of people from lots of operators, and we wanted global coverage. So we covered the UK, the US, and Japan as a way of trying to represent key areas in different regions. And what was interesting is that the key driver for everyone that we talked to was providing indoor coverage for voice. So the kind of the sort of the golden service was actually voice, and the thing that was driving enterprises to want indoor coverage and improved indoor 3G coverage here was because the voice quality was rubbish. Because that's getting harder as modern buildings get better insulation. It's getting harder and harder to get that indoor coverage. So, if you can then get an enterprise that's already got fantastic IT everywhere, and they've got IT managers that are used to putting Wi-Fi cells up everywhere, and then you've got the whole way in which IT people deploy their infrastructure is completely different to how gold-plated operators deploy their infrastructure. So if an operator wants to deploy their infrastructure, they'll tend to employ really sort of gold-plated solutions, whether it be DAS-type antennas, or they'll do detailed surveys, they'll do, they'll check it, they'll put it in, they'll have it on a test rig for 5 years, then they'll decide to roll it out. Compare that to the kind of IT mentality where you'll get a Wi-Fi access point, you plug an Ethernet cable in, and that's good enough. And there's a very different cost of deployment there. So one of the things that the enterprise was trying to do is to allow enterprises to roll out small cells within the building, within their own buildings. But that means that the operators would then get indoor coverage. Operators wouldn't have to worry about the backhaul. They'd have to get connectivity into their core network, and they'd have to control that. The enterprises wouldn't need to have their PABXs anymore. People would then have the one small, mobile phone that would know when they're at home, when they're at work. It could do optimal routing between sites that they might have in different parts of the world if it's a large corporation. So let's look at the business case aspects, both for operators and for the enterprises. And let's assume that we can take all the advantages of the different paradigm of deploying the networks. And you can let the IT guys in the enterprise do the enterprise internal deployment, perhaps. Okay, what do we get? Let's start on the right-hand side, and you can see that there are different costs and benefits adding up in this little waterfall chart on the right-hand side. And you can see that the operator's having to spend some money on small cells. You can see that they've got savings on their network costs. Key benefits might be that because people are fed up with the voice quality inside the building, they're much more likely to stay loyal to the operator, which huge benefits and reduced churn. And of course, it costs operators a lot less to retain customers if you do that. Then there's all the added value services that you can get if you've actually deployed small cells. You've got a lot more location data, you've got a lot more the actual stats that are obtained. For example, if you're putting that inside a shopping centre, there's lots of enhanced added value services as well. From the customer's perspective in the enterprise, you can get rid of your PABX, your SED, you can simplify your desktop hardware, all these other things you can actually see there's a benefit. And then here's a thing that's probably important. I think when I was probably doing my postgraduate work with a technical, very much a technical only perspective, we're kind of taught in engineering, well, when that bit goes up, this bit goes down, or whatever, and intuitively there's this trade-off, and there's zero-sum games. Quite often is how that gets translated into our perception, and of course it's really not the case at all in some cases. And lots of these things, there's an economic benefit to all parties if it can be done properly. And it's interesting just to try to bear that in mind. Okay. We're still on to finish this, have some questions, and be done before we're done. Okay. So, now let's talk about 5G NORMA. And the challenge now is, well, how do we go about trying to cost a 5G network How do we work out the benefits? How do we work out the costs? We don't really know what it looks like yet. We don't really know, what the network. We don't even know what the services are all going to be in their entirety. And we're still trying to work out some of the aspects of the architecture and all these other things. So how do we go about trying to get some handle on the key outcomes that are actually going to drive whether it's going to work or not work? There's no point doing it if it's not going to be commercially feasible. Okay. So key things. We do expect that there's going to be a benefit because we can introduce services rapidly and quickly. It doesn't have to have without disrupting all the other services that are ongoing in the network. We know it can support multiple services. We know it can support multiple operators. Think back to the Dutch case study. The economic benefits of having access to more spectrum is a complete no-brainer. The threat and the reason why you want more operators is to get more competition. So can you get more competition and still have access to as much spectrum as is available and used to maximise that trunking benefit? Well, ideally we should be able to do much more of that with 5G if we've got more share. We expect that it's going to be more efficient technology because things improve and spectrum efficiency increases, and we can see that. We'll talk about security and reliability later, but obviously if you're opening up the architecture of the mobile network, there's aspects of security that might not all, most of these things are actually clearly positive. Aspects of opening up the network, that could be tricky. And of course, we're going to have much more energy efficient technology as inevitably as things improve. Well, how do they drive through into economic benefits? Well, we can work out with business models, other cost savings, and so on. And we can work out some of these societal benefits by looking at these different services and how it will impact on other people's lives and what they're prepared to pay compared to how much it costs to provide them. Okay. Okay, how are we going to do this with 5G NORMA? So we've got the RAN and the core network driving this, software-defined network, and we've got the virtualization, we've got the slices, we've got the same hardware that's shared, although logically separated. We expect to be able to take the infrastructure and be able to shift where information is processed. It doesn't all have to be done at the base station and then straight into the core. How do we look at how these things can be dynamically reallocated to use any available infrastructure that exists somewhere in the network if the connectivity is good enough? We've then got the benefits of virtualization. We should be able to have these things running on generic bits of kit if we can. And we're going to maximize the reuse and the trunking benefits and the sharing that we can get by having this shared network. So all of these things we want to take into account. Okay, we've got different use cases that we need to take into account, and we've got these because there's new services and we're going to be able to deploy things in a new and different way. We've got to take into account the social benefits as well as these new services. We're going to take into account their use by different types of people. Again, that's kind of fairly standard, so that's not that new. We're then going to have to do the cost modelling and get all these things. Then we're going to chuck it in and we'll look at the same kind of metrics, kind of similar really. This graph is there. It's meant to remind you a little bit of how we took those benefits into account with the enterprise business case. We can take the different metrics that we're interested in for the different services, for different users, and add them up and evaluate them. Okay, and then of course we've got the policy outcomes. Overall, at the end of the day, in the same way that it's, for example, in the Dutch case, where we looked at what's the policy outcome in terms of the number of operators, what does that mean for society, what does that mean for the operators, is it viable, is it feasible? We can look at that for across Europe. Remember we had that model for the 4G network. For 5G, it's slightly more complicated, we think. It's actually no longer possible, really, to separate the topology and the technology. We now don't have three discrete elements that we can play with to increase the capacity of the network. They're interrelated. Oops, excuse me. So, depending on the technology that's there, we can't really just decouple it from the topology because we're using that connectivity between the different parts of the infrastructure to reuse capacity if it exists elsewhere. And the network functions are actually going to be performed at different parts of the network. So we've got to take that into account. If we take spectrum, we can't fully decouple technology in the spectrum either. We're going to have MIMO capability. We're also going to have to take into account much more sophisticated interference cancellation benefits, because if we're going to combine the processing at central nodes, we can actually take into account the interference reduction that should be feasible if we do joint processing. Okay. Here's our generic kind of distributed architecture. Have you guys seen all these kind of things earlier on today and yesterday? Okay. Okay, slightly different. We have, say, the antenna sites, and traditionally for a 4G network, that's where all your processing would be. You know, you'd receive the signals at the base station, you'd have the antenna, you'd process it, and then you'd squirt it down the backhaul to an RNC and into the core, or gateway and things. Well, now we're actually going to have different types of capability. We're also going to be able to process service layer functionality at the edge. We're going to not just process at some sites, we'll be able to process the entire protocol stack, including having server-type applications at the edge. And if there's extra capacity in some of those sites, we might not have to go all the way into the core network in order to access it. We can go via any connectivity there to use the infrastructure that's available. Okay. So, how do we go about trying to get the cost of these things that don't yet exist? Okay. Well, obviously we can look at, if it already exists, we can reuse it. We can kind of extrapolate, and then we can look at reasonable technology changes that we can anticipate. We can also look at the roadmap. We know what everyone else is likely to be doing. We know what the standards process is in terms of performance benefit. When it comes to other things like this, the cloud-based computing, we don't have that yet in comms, but we do have it in the IT industry. We can look at how orchestration functions, etc. We don't really know the costs of that, but can we associate that with a certain percentage? And it's back down to, we don't have to get everything, we will not get the right number. It's not going to be 35,421,006 but what we can do is we can do a sensitivity analysis, and we can bracket it, and we can get something reasonable, and we can work out that if it was above this or below that, then that's a crunch time and it might not be cost effective. But if it's somewhere in that band, then that's a feasible deployment model that will have these benefits. Does that make sense? Okay. So, the key things that we want to do, and the key questions really that we want to ask is, will 5G NORMA have a cost advantage? And is it going to be more profitable than the legacy 4G technology? So they're the key things that we're interested in answering. And by understanding the range of parameters under which there's a success there, then we know what the feasible range is for these networks, given the information that we'll have at the time. At least about 12 minutes. Does anyone have any questions?
So let me first thank you, Tom. Quite a different topic than what we had before.
At 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
And 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the second day session. So, are there any questions from the audience? See this. Thank you for the.
Anyway, I can be a little bit loud. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. Just a quick question. I mean, all previous generations have been kind of a replacement. I mean, 2G was a replacement to the analog. 3G was a replacement to 2G, 4G a replacement to 3G. But 5G might not be exactly the same story. Or is it? And if it is, what are the implications on, on the model?
So I think the answer is probably yes and no. In that the first priority for 5G is likely to be to deliver mobile broadband at least as efficiently as 4G does. And other advantages for other services are in addition to that. So the first thing is, and in fact it's like almost anything else, you've got to be at least as good as the incumbent, and then there's all the extra bits too. So by its nature, the new technology has to at least supplant the existing. And I guess the bit about 5G and our vision for 5G NORMA is what those extra bits are. And if you look at different people who've got different visions for 5G NORMA, it could either be improvements in technology as opposed to improvements in the efficiency of the architecture, which is the normal case really. So I think that extra bit depends on your view as to what 5G is.
So the microphone.
And for your model, how accurate do you need to be for the output?
So yeah. In a sense, I don't know. And I'm not sure that it has to be precise. So in terms of how accurately would we cost an operator's network, in terms of working out its viability or non-viability, that's all that matters. For example, the 800 megahertz coverage obligation, it was good enough, and all the assumptions verified and qualified and agreed by operators, and the approach and the coverage methodology all agreed, people buy into it. Is that actually an adequate model? Not really, because it's predicated on one user per cell in the uplink, etc. We could question just whether that's a valid assumption. And in fact, everyone would say, well, of course it's not. But that's the basis, because it's a bit like testing cars for their fuel economy. You've got to get it you need a test, it's a standard test, and a benchmark against which things can be assessed. You can't take a car and take representative driving because my representative driving is different from yours. And when I do it today, and it's a nice day, it's quite different than if I did it and it was snowing. So we need to have a standard test that doesn't include all the variability of real life. Similarly, when we're doing this, we've got to have reasonable assumptions that are as good as we can anticipate. For example, we're including things like different waveforms. We're expected to have a 10% spectrum efficiency improvement compared to existing OFDM waveforms. We can take that into account. We can take into account improvements and everything else. Will we get it right? No. But we're worried about the odd few percent. But then what we're interested in is some of the other assumptions that drive things. And if we can bracket it and we get the same kind of trends, then we know the range that it's likely to be in.
So you use an example.
Yeah, it's going to be between here and here. Yeah.
Hi.
Okay.
I'll give them the mic. Thanks for the talk. I was interested, this is the sort of range of, because it says the 5G NORMA network, is that, I'm kind of assuming that's the 5G NORMA architecture, but there's the 5 GPP is a sort of the white paper on a 5G architectures, and there's some different approaches as to how different people see the 5G architecture. There seems to be some fairly wide-ranging different approaches looking for different projects and maybe different places like the 5G IC and so on. I wondered whether the 5G NORMA project will just be analysing what their view of the network will ultimately be, or whether they'll do an analysis of, say, other candidate architectures as well, and maybe possibly sort of key innovations that maybe large organisations like, say, China Mobile or something might be bringing into the table.
So the 5G NORMA, in fact, I could actually defer to my colleagues who are experts in the architecture side of things here. And I will do. But the 5G, the concept is based on this flexible network of sharing and slicing and flexible service introduction. So that's the focus really of the study. But I think I'll pass on to Peter.
Yeah, so in 5G NORMA, the investigations or the techno-economic investigation is going to be based on the 5G NORMA architecture. It will not take into account what other projects are doing for the simple reason that it's a resource issue. There's actually two issues. One is hand and egg problem, so because we want to do our analysis and the other projects are investigating different technologies, and then we have to wait till they give us their results, and it's a pure management problem, but also resource problem. And even agreeing on what is going to be modeled into this techno-economic analysis, even if it is 5G NORMA architecture, is already a huge leap forward for us. Now, taking into account also other fora would be just too much. But so I think Charles emphasized that whatever we do, particularly in this part, is public domain. So it's going to be published. There's going to be an online tool that everyone can use, and if there are other projects or other fora, they actually can use this tool. They can tweak it and use it for their analysis.
Okay, so you need to decide upon your architecture before you then do this analysis. But I suppose in some sense it could be useful to work out which might be the most cost-effective architecture as opposed to changing and then analysing the cost benefits and then seeing which one is the sort of best fit. Okay.
So to answer that, for example, we'd almost do it the other way around, in that we could say, what is the cost if it's one operator running this network? Well, what is the cost and what's the saving if it's shared, for example? So we'd answer the question the other way around in that sense. and then we'd understand what the benefits of flexible sharing would be. We'd say, what's the advantage of having this, and we can introduce multiple services, versus what would happen if we had a network and it couldn't accommodate multiple services. You have this for this service, and then you have an overlay network for machine-to-machine or IoT and whatever.
Right. Yeah, one more question.
Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I'm just a bit worried, and I'm begging that you clear me. If you are working on that Ofcom, will this splicing make your operations free, or are you going to be other license?
So I think you were saying, is it about the use of licensed spectrum and unlicensed?
Are you using the licensed spectrum or unlicensed spectrum?
Right. So we can throw as much spectrum at this as we want, in a sense, and whether it's, as long as we take into account the performance of licensed or unlicensed, it doesn't matter. I think another way of answering your question is that I think every European operator or regulator at the moment doesn't allow different operators to share access to the same spectrum. Now we're going to allow that in our modelling. And if we go back to that Dutch example that we used, in fact, when we were doing the analysis for the 3G option in the UK, all the traffic in the UK could have been accommodated on 4 carriers. And there were 12 carriers available. And as soon as you fragmented, it was possible that when you only had 2 carriers, some operators couldn't support their share of the traffic. So that's just a little insight into the massive benefits you can get by having access to more trunking efficiency. Yeah. And at the moment, European regulators do not allow operators to share access to spectrum. Now, one of the key things that we want to do is to allow sharing spectrum, sharing hardware, sharing access to infrastructure. Yeah. So in a sense, the regulatory paradigm has to change anyway. And after WRC 15, we could even argue that the regulatory paradigm has to change because it's not working at the moment, the way that the spectrum is divided up, and it's almost too slow. So I think it's wrong for us in this research project to try to fit what's possible into this regulatory paradigm that European operators have. It almost certainly has to change. And we're looking at what's the best we can do, not how to fit in with what someone says they have done in the past.
All right. One last question. Otherwise, I think we can. Okay. Then first, thanks again, Charles. One more note for you, actually two barcodes at the wall. Please scan it, go on our website, and we are very much interested in your feedback. What you think about the summer school, whether it's informative, whether something's missing, whether something was too much or whatever. Just please give us feedback. It will most likely not be the last summer school organized by a European project, and your feedback is very much valued. Secondly, tomorrow we start again at 9 with an SDN and NFV session, and afterwards one more session on network orchestration and management. So it's only a session at the morning so that you can travel home very easily in the afternoon. So thanks again for your attention today. See you hopefully tomorrow, and please don't forget to give us feedback.